Hello, welcome to another alarming talk of the sort in which I specialize. We don't seem to be getting the PowerPoint up and running successfully, which is a great pity because the talk's pretty bad, but the PowerPoint was really cool. Anyway, life is full of disappointments, so there we are. The title of this talk, I think, puts the matter pretty starkly, but my argument is this. The 20th century came as a considerable shock to its inhabitants. And a debacle on this scale requires a serious explanation. You got World War I, you got Bolshevism, you got Nazism, you got Dadaism, you got the Holocaust. All of this following on Victorian hopes of progress in war and peace and in so many other areas. We were meant to be moving gradually and inexorably forward into the sunlit uplands, even accelerating mankind freed by the Enlightenment from superstition and also struck off the shackles of want, ignorance, and war. And then you got Hitler and Stalin and genocide and global war. It seems like something of a non sequitur. And the globe was bedeviled in the 20th century not just by war, not just by slaughter on an unprecedented scale, but by ideological aggression, these pathological and apparently novel belief systems that attacked reason as viciously as they attacked their neighbors and human dignity. So what went wrong? How did things turn so sour so quickly? I mean, how do you get from burying Darwin in Westminster Abbey to the Somme and then to Auschwitz? This is not a normal kind of predictable progression, and indeed very, very few people predicted it, though perhaps there were some voices crying in the wilderness on this point. And of course, it has a lot of causes. History is a very complicated thing. There are political causes, economic causes, military ones, even demographic ones. But behind them, as there usually is, there was an intellectual and even a spiritual crisis. This poisonous fruit grew from deep, toxic roots, and most particularly, the taproot of it all, I suggest, is the rejection of reason in the name of reason, and the rejection of morality in the name of morality. Over the last 500 years, we have not freed ourselves from superstition. We've freed ourselves from truth. Reason has been gnawing away at its own tail, and by the 20th century, it reached a head and went crunch. We convinced ourselves that reason was powerless, circular, formal, and empty. And when truth had fled, something terrible filled the void. As indeed I would say that it always must. Something's got to fill the void. Humans are constituted to feel a need, an urgent need for meaning. If we cannot find meaning in the universe, we either sink into lethal apathy or we try to construct it out of unsuitable materials. And the result is self-destruction in some form or another. Personal or sometimes, as in the 20th century, on a much grander scale. And that's my argument that we must choose God or Hitler, and that the 20th century chose Hitler. Now, in order to substantiate this cosmic claim, I want to do two things. The first is just to sketch out the radical relativism at the heart of modernity, and particularly postmodernism. And then I want to make the argument that Nazism, as well as Bolshevism, was not a rejection of modernity and its dilemmas, but an embrace of the death of God and of truth. Although Nazism looks in some superficial ways like a reactionary movement and has been portrayed as conservatism with the mask off, it's really something very, very different. Well, I said I wanted to do two things. I have to do three things, actually, because you know that participants in the conference have to do this thing where they declare conflicts of interest and disclose them to the audience, and I had a very funny slide about that. So now you laugh now because I'm going to muff the joke in person, but also have to specify the learning objectives. So, obviously this concern about conflict of interest is more about people in clinical practice than it is for historians. Yes, I want you to get history, but that's... I don't stand to make a lot of money. I do stand to make some. I am crowdfunded. I sell documentaries and books, and you're all, of course, encouraged to go and make a $5 monthly pledge. So I have a conflict of interest that I want you to give me money. So it didn't get any starker than that. It's not that big a conflict, though, because you're more likely to do it if I'm good than if I'm bad. If my talk makes you need a stiff drink, I don't own shares in liquor companies. If you need a tranquilizer, I don't own shares in pharmaceutical companies. So it's pretty innocent there. As for the issue of brand names versus generics that came up, I'm going to talk about the generic phenomenon of totalitarianism and then a couple of specific brands, Nazism and Bolshevism. But I trust it will become clear in short order that I'm not recommending that you consume either. So that's I'm not peddling these things. As for the learning objectives, there are 5 of them, broadly speaking here: to understand the historical foundations of medical ethics, to trace the cultural development of medicine, to explain the interaction of politics in medicine, to defend the tenets of medical ethics, and to talk about the role of religion in the health of the whole person. So I'm especially focused on 1, 3, and 4 here: historical foundations, interaction of politics in medicine, and defending the tenets of medical ethics. And of course, if you've looked at the end of the book, right, then you know that both the Nazis and the Soviets engaged in egregious violations of anything that we would think of as medical ethics. But they didn't do it because they didn't have medical ethics. They did it because they had a very different kind of medical ethics. Their idea of what constituted ethics, is good for the revolution is ethical, or what is good for the master race is ethical, are built up from the same foundations as all the other toxic stuff that is going to bubble forth in the course of this lecture. They're not accidental. They're not bugs. They're features. And the use of sophisticated chemical techniques and medical studies to exterminate people en masse. It's not actually easy to exterminate people en masse. People are hard to kill and harder to get rid of once you've killed them. It takes a lot of diligent scientific application of the kind of things that ought to be used to preserve and enhance life. The Soviets put dissidents in mental hospitals and in some cases gave them psychotropic drugs. The purpose of a Soviet mental hospital for these people was not to cure you, but to make you insane. And again, this to them seemed like the acme of ethical behavior, whereas it's fairly clear, I think, in this room, that it was the opposite. But in my view, all of this stems from a rejection of God and truth, which, of course, for Christians are literally the same, thanks to John 14:6. And this comes out of this rejection of truth and the embrace of postmodernism, an acceptance that truth is dead, and that if we're going to find some reason to continue, it cannot be by looking backward, by somehow restoring truth. Now, my view is that the 20th century's agonies, and this includes far more than the geopolitics, but that's what we're focusing on right now, reflect radical relativism at the heart of postmodernism. The idea that all there are is competing narratives in a power struggle, that we are not attempting to find what is really true. We are simply trying to shove our view down the other person's throat. That's not how they tend to put it in the academy, but I think it does really boil down to that. And I presume most of you know and loathe postmodernism. It's certainly all around us. But it's possible that some of you would regard it as a fairly recent thing, a child of the 60s. Somehow, people like Jacques Derrida and that crowd, and the hollow men and women who now dominate the academy. But in my view, they are not creative people. And the intellectual things that they are peddling or passing on or attempting to instruct people in are not things they themselves devised. These are things that were brought properly together in coherent intellectual form in a much more creative and dynamic age, that by the 19th century, all of this stuff is in place and the implications of it are then going to work themselves out. I was thinking, if anybody here has seen Kathy Newman's dismally failed attempt to take down Jordan Peterson, you realize that Ms. Newman, who obviously is a bright, articulate, successful, well-educated person, was so far out of her depth that she didn't know it until he said, "Gotcha." At which point she had the good grace to say, "Yes, you did." But she'd never thought about any of this. She'd never been exposed to it. In all her years at university, if you haven't seen the video, it's an amazing, this BBC interviewer who asks Jordan Peterson, "How dare you try to make me uncomfortable?" And Peterson says, "Well, you're trying to make me uncomfortable." And she sits there stunned. It had never crossed her mind, and it got worse from there. But it's not the Cathy Newmans of this world who've given us postmodernism. They have inherited it, and they are attempting to pass it on. But it really is visible, starkly visible, in Victorian times. And that's why this slide you're not now looking at has 3 people on it. And they're Friedrich Nietzsche, Fyodor Dostoyevsky, and Joseph Conrad, who are all 19th century figures. I can prove it to you. Conrad actually lived into the 20th century, from 1857 to 1924, but he published what I think is his masterpiece, that's Heart of Darkness, in serial form in 1899 in 3 parts in Blackwood's magazine, and then it appears in book form 3 years later. Nietzsche lived from 1844 to 1900, Dostoevsky 1821 to 1881, so we're right smack dab in the Victorian era here. And especially you look at pictures of even of Nietzsche, if you don't know who he is, they seem to have a bit of that stuffy Victorian atmosphere that comes from having to freeze while the camera very slowly exposes the plate. But these people are intellectually active at the end of a long period of development of thought about the nature of reason, the intellectual endeavor, and of man in society. And all 3 of them saw what would happen when reason sawed through the ladder up which it had climbed to get a better view of itself. I mean, and I must admit, I had long despised Friedrich Nietzsche because the people he inspired struck me as a kind of contemptible lot. And I figured Nietzsche was one of them. But, I've come to appreciate, and this is partly because of a talk that I saw Jordan Peterson give, which is why I signed that thing about the tarantulas to you, that like Machiavelli writing The Prince, in my view, Nietzsche was not celebrating. Nietzsche was warning. Nietzsche was horror-stricken by the emergence of the Superman, by the transvaluation of all values. But he thought that it was very hard not to go in that direction. He was at least trying to tell us to go with our eyes open. With Dostoyevsky's line, if God is dead, everything is allowed. Well, that's what Nietzsche was talking about, and not happily. I mean, Nietzsche wasn't really given to happy anyway. Good old Freddie, but he did have something really important to warn us against. And the question is, but what is it? How did God die? What? And why is everything allowed if God is dead? And the way it seems to me that God died is that reason started by examining the world, and more it got concerned about deficiencies in the human intellect, and it studied itself. More and more, reason examined its own operations instead of looking at the world. Even from Immanuel Kant and his critique of pure reason and the fact that there are some things the mind cannot know, and then there are other things he thinks we're disposed to think whether they make any sense or not. And then you get David Hume saying we have no real reason to believe in cause and effect. It's just something we're stuck with. It's in our brains and we can't do anything about it except be aware that it's not rationally grounded. And C.S. Lewis has a marvelous passage about trying to understand your own mind and its defects. And he says that this, in a way, this is a hopeless enterprise because what you're doing is you're checking a bent ruler against the same bent ruler. And how are you going to figure out what's wrong with it or how to straighten it? And of course, Lewis's argument is that something breaks in that is not bent. And that is how we know that we are flawed. But if you don't do that, well, as Lewis himself puts it about one of his characters in That Hideous Strength, that he passed from Hegel into Hume, thence through pragmatism, and thence through logical positivism, and at last out into the complete void. That's the fate of John Wither. If you haven't read the Perilander trilogy, I'm a very big fan of it. It's less well known than Narnia. But That Hideous Strength is a absolutely hair-raising page-turner. And a number of things are feeding together into this. You've got the work of the abstract philosophers, but you've also got the Darwinians. I mean, the thing about burying Darwin in Westminster Abbey, that maybe they could have found another spot for him. Yes, he was a distinguished Englishman, and that's what you did with distinguished Englishmen when they died. But this idea that we are just a product of our DNA, that not just that evolution is the survival of the fittest, but that we are material objects, and that our behavior and our thought patterns and everything else are conditioned by the chemical reactions that are going on inside our bodies, that in turn are driven by the structure of our DNA, which in turn is created by our ancestors' DNA, and you go all the way back to the Big Bang, and it's all inexorably and mechanically determined. If that's true, then your thoughts at this moment are not an active, creative thing you're doing where there's discretion and discernment. They are just the inevitable electrochemical epiphenomena of these chemical reactions that are going on in your system. So if what you're thinking is true, it is pure coincidence that it happens to be true, and you have no way of telling that it's true because all you've got is these thoughts that are just being projected inside your brain. I mean, it's like being Alec in A Clockwork Orange. You're strapped down, forced to watch your own thoughts, except there's no point to making you watch them. There's nothing you can do about it. It's all just a trick of the genes. And this, of course, is an enormously destructive attack on reason. Because your thoughts aren't thoughts. This is what Lewis talks about arguing with the materialist, the man who says he's not really there. He says, how do you argue with a man who insists he's not up on stage with you? I once worked with somebody like this, who was passionately insisted that our thoughts were all the product of biochemistry. To which I would, well, then that one must be too, right? You have no warrant for believing that thought. Your brain just threw it at you, and you stand there a helpless bystander to these mental processes. And yet he was very passionate about it. But then, of course, he'd say, well, I can't help it. It's just programmed into me. I'm sorry. This, of course, to some extent, all of this it's an untestable, it's not a real scientific theory. Because how could you tell if your thoughts were predetermined? Right? What possible empirical experiment could you perform? And even if you did it, both it and what you thought of it would also be predetermined, right? There's no there. But this is the way that we increasingly came to think about everything, about the survival of the fittest, about all the attributes of living beings. They're just, chicken is just an egg's way of making more eggs. And cultural habits are not things people do because they're true. They're things people do because they're functional. They tend to perpetuate the society and the individuals within it. And so the question of whether beliefs are true or not becomes the wrong question. All we want to know is, do they work? And it's not just that we have to weigh whether they work against whether they're really true. There's no really true. All there is this rough and ready utilitarianism going on. And even science itself has given up the idea that we're finding truth and saying, well, every theory is just an internally consistent set of hypotheses that chugs along until too many anomalies accumulate, and then we come up with another provisional theory, which again lasts until we come up with something different. So we're not looking for finality in scientific theories. But if the point is not to find the truth, it's because there is no truth. There are just things that seem to work better and work in their own terms for a while, and then we go on to something else. So this relativism is everywhere. And of course, at this point, we stop believing in anything. I mean, this whole thing with the transgender, that people will tell you at one and the same time that the fact that you have certain anatomical characteristics doesn't make you male or female. And then they'll tell you gender is socially constructed. And you say, but if a person being born with a certain biological configuration is therefore told by society relentlessly, you are a man because you have a you-know-what, you-know-where, how could a person know they're really a woman if gender is socially constructed? There is no such thing as a woman. The whole thing is absolutely incoherent from the point of view that there might really be a truth about what gender you are. But we don't believe in that anymore. And this sort of is a kind of doublethink. But the problem is, from inside it's coherent, and this long attack on reason means that from the outside, there's no way to get outside it and decide which of these internally consistent systems is actually correct. Now, to narrow this down a little bit, let me bring Joseph Conrad on stage. As I said, I think Heart of Darkness is a brilliant book. I also very much like The Secret Agent, but I can't stand Lord Jim or Nostromo, so I'm a half Conrad fan and a half Conrad non-fan. But as you know, Heart of Darkness looks like an indictment of colonialism. It's pretty obviously about the Belgian Congo, one of the most appalling of all European colonies, which had the weirdest balance of trade anybody's ever seen. It exported rubber and it imported bullets. That can't be good, right? And so Conrad writes this novel with a narrator who's basically Conrad, thinly disguised as Marlowe, about Kurtz, who is an exemplar of Western civilization, the finest man you could ever meet, who's gone into darkest Africa to bring them all the benefits of Victorian civilization, including Christianity, free enterprise, liberal democracy, everything that the benighted locals desperately need and don't have. And unlike the purely brutal and exploitative colonial administrators, Kurtz takes the natives seriously. He wants to be able to talk to them, to communicate with them, to explain to them why they should change their ways and how. If he were just a bad man, the novel would be kind of second-rate and possibly vaguely interesting. His fall or his remaining in the depths wouldn't have a whole lot to tell us, except, don't be a Belgian Congo administrator. But it's not that at all. Kurtz is a very good man, and in order to show the locals the error of their ways, he studies their culture. He treats it as worthy of respect. He tries to figure out how it looks from inside so that he can get into their minds and guide them to the truth. And as he does this, something terrible happens to him. The more he studies their culture, the more he realizes that it is internally consistent. And based on its own axioms, it is morally and intellectually valid. And Victorian England is foolish. And the more he thinks about this and how this is true of all cultures, the more he decides that every culture is simply functionally consistent on its own terms, and no culture has or can have the truth. So then he sets himself up as a god and enjoys all the favors that you imagine would come with being a god in the middle of Africa, and he becomes a brute. But the problem, the question Conrad is asking is, well, why shouldn't he? If there is no truth, why not at least have a good time? And if there is truth, where are we going to find it? And I looked at the Wikipedia article on Kurtz, by the way, and it says, over the course of his stay in Africa, Kurtz becomes corrupted. He takes his pamphlet and scribbles in at the very end the words, exterminate all the brutes. But Kurtz doesn't become corrupted. It's a far more terrible fate. He becomes liberated. And he doesn't want to be. He is liberated from moral strictures and the confines of truth, not as a grand act of rebellion, but because they dissolve before his horrified eyes. It all just melts away into nothing. His final words are, the horror, the horror. What Kurtz found in the heart of Africa was something terrible, but it wasn't specific to Africa. It was moral relativism. He had seen what it was like and how terrible it was, and he'd seen no way out of it. And the reason that he wrote exterminate all the brutes in his journal wasn't because he thought the Africans were worse than other people and needed to die. It's because the only way to keep everybody from getting to where he'd gotten to was to destroy the evidence. And of course, by this point, Kurtz has no problem with mass extermination because he's ceased to believe in truth. He's ceased to believe in goodness. He's ceased to believe in virtue and right and wrong. And of course, again, if you take anthropology at university, you're going to get structural functionalism and all this. I don't know what they call it today. But it just tells you that all elements of culture are just things that fit together in such a way as to perpetuate the survival of the group and its beliefs. They're the cultural equivalent of DNA. There's no point asking if it's true or not, who's got the real God. All you have to just ask is, does this religion knit the family and the society together, give people moral guidelines, show them who they are and how they're meant to act, and so forth. Now, I said the narrator is based on Conrad, but in Heart of Darkness, Conrad is expressing his own horrified convictions. He wrote a letter to a close friend in December of 1897 about the fact that the whole universe had evolved randomly. He said, out of a chaos of scraps of iron. And then it knits. And I feel that it ought to embroider, but it goes on knitting. And you say, okay, well, we just have to give it the right kind of celestial oil and it will make something beautiful. But no, you cannot change what it does. And the most withering thought is that this infamous thing has made itself without thought, without conscience, without foresight, without eyes, without heart. It is a tragic accident, and it has happened. You can't interfere with it. The last drop of bitterness is in the suspicion you can't even smash it. It has knitted time, space, pain, death, corruption, despair, and all the illusions, and nothing matters. That's Conrad speaking, and that's why he wrote the novel. Because he, too, had seen what Nietzsche and Dostoyevsky had seen. That in a material universe, there is no possibility whatsoever of meaning. And I don't know if an audience like this is liable to contain a huge group of H.P. Lovecraft fans. Do you have any H.P. Lovecraft fans here? We got one, sort of. Lovecraft is this really peculiar horror writer, an atheist, a socialist, with an almost autistic streak, I think. As if I read one more story about gambrel roofs in H.P. Lovecraft, I shall emit an eldritch scream. But Lovecraft had seen exactly the same thing. And in a number of his stories, he talks about finding God. The god Azathoth, the lord of all things, encircled by his flopping horde of mindless and amorphous dancers and lulled by the thin, monotonous piping of a demonic flute held in nameless paws, because the god is a blind idiot. That's the phrase he used, the blind idiot god. And in this great book of ancient wisdom that he's invented called the Necronomicon, they give this thing a name and claim it's a god because they don't want people to despair completely. But what Lovecraft is telling you is when you go looking for God, if you look for God and don't find him, there's still the hope that you might. But what if you find him and he's an idiot? What if there's nothing there? Then you've had it. There's nowhere else to look. And that's where these 19th century thinkers found them. And it's C.S. Lewis, again in the Paralander trilogy, at one point the hero, beset by demonic tormentors, has this hideous vision. What if it really is true, this material universe? And then you know the meaningless, the unmade, the omnipotent idiocy to which all spirits were irrelevant and before which all efforts were vain. So there's the Victorian nightmare that we lived in the 20th century. And remind you, Heart of Darkness is written in the late 1890s when one Adolf Hitler is but a lad. So here's this passage. Somebody visits Marlowe and says Kurtz's proper sphere ought to have been politics on the popular side. He said, Kurtz couldn't really write, but heavens how the man could talk. He electrified large meetings. He had faith, don't you see? He had the faith. He could get himself to believe anything. He would have been a splendid leader of an extreme party. And Marlowe says, what party? And the visitor says, any party. He was an extremist. Well, my goodness, an extremist who could make himself believe anything. Who's read 1984? Right? There you are. This is the core of that totalitarian mindset. And this is who Kurtz is. And this is what Conrad's warning is. And this is what Nazism is all about. About a will to believe in place of a reason to believe. I mean, if you look at Nazism considered as an intellectual theory, it's a bit of a mishmash, isn't it? I mean, there's Norse myth here, there's pseudoscience, there's populist economics, all kinds of fragments of the postmodern junkyard thrown together. But it has no authentic connection to any organic tradition. For instance, Hitler is not a monarchist, is he? He thought Kaiser Wilhelm II was an idiot, which possibly was a justified opinion. Hitler was an evil man, but he was no stooge. Apparently after the fall of Paris in 1940, the Kaiser wrote to Hitler and said, congratulations, you have taken Paris with my armies, prompting Hitler to say to his valet, what an idiot. Hitler's not a Christian. Hitler is not connected to any authentic past and any belief in genuine truths that have survived down through the years. Nietzsche understood that if God is dead, anything is permitted. Then Sartre came along and said, but it doesn't matter because everything is meaningless. And in a way, that's the logical position. Everything's permitted, but nothing's any fun. Well, it's not true that nothing is any fun, right? There's still sex and there's still food. Right? So anybody who eats 3 meals a day knows why cookbooks outsell sex manuals. But hedonism is one possible response to this problem. And of course, you see an enormous amount of hedonism out there these days. The Playboy philosophy lives on. It seems to have reached the White House. But it's pretty seedy, isn't it? I mean, the Playboy mansion is pretty ramshackle. It's no St. Peter's, let's be honest here. And people aren't really made to go face down into the trough. We're not very happy there. There was an interview with Hugh Hefner late in life in which he sobbed on television, "I've been looking for love in all the wrong places." He said, well, thanks for sharing that with us. Pity you didn't think of it sooner, but we'll take the repentant sinner at any stage here. But in fact, there is another possibility other than just lying down and dying or stuffing your face and so forth and such like. Or you could try to reject relativism, which I trust is the prescription you're all going to accept at the end of the talk. But the other thing is to give in with a roar instead of with an oink. To say, okay, fine, it doesn't mean anything, I'm going to make it mean something. Like Milton's Satan, this grandiose Wagnerian rebellion against the meaninglessness of it all. We are going to conjure something into existence by sheer audacity in the face of this certain defeat out there. Mussolini, who's a farce to Hitler's tragedy and a windy would-be philosopher, once summed the whole thing up. He said, the Democrats of Il Mondo want to know our program. It is to break the bones of the Democrats of Il Mondo, and the sooner the better. Right? Now and fascism was all full of virility and manliness. There's a manly response to meaninglessness. I'm going to punch somebody into a hospital. And Mussolini's answer to there being no truth isn't to say, no, there is truth, here it is. It is to embrace it with clenched fists. And in some sense, of course, the whole thing is refuted right there. I love to quote Philip K. Dick that reality is that which when you stop believing it, it doesn't go away. Right? And I don't care how much of a relativist you are. If somebody breaks your bones, you have to lie down and recuperate. If they shoot you in the back of the head, you stop thinking life is meaningless because you stop thinking altogether. There's actually a G.K. Chesterton novel where his hero keeps meeting these modern young men who say life is meaningless, and he pulls out a revolver and offers to shoot them, and of course they all beg for their lives. And he says, I didn't think you really believed it. But Mussolini's impudent but kind of low-rent resort to violence in the face of there being no truth is very reminiscent of a line that's actually been attributed to all kinds of Nazi bigwigs, that whenever I hear the word culture, I reach for my revolver. It is actually from a Nazi playwright, Hans Jost, a play called Schlag, which was written to celebrate the Nazis taking power and was performed on Hitler's 44th birthday, in which the hero says to a friend, no paradise will entice you out of your barbed wire entanglement. And the guy says, that's for damn sure. Barbed wire is barbed wire. I know what I'm up against. No rose without a thorn. And the last thing I'll stand for is ideas to get the better of me. I know that rubbish from 1918. Fraternity, equality, freedom, beauty, and dignity. You got to use the right bait to hook them. And then you're right in the middle of a parley and they say, hands up, you're disarmed. You Republican voting swine. No, let them keep their good distance with their whole ideological kettle of fish. I shoot with live ammunition. When I heard the word culture, I released the safety on my Browning. Right? That is an embrace of the death of truth. That is someone who is not claiming, no, truth is still alive and well. That is somebody who's saying, fine, truth is dead, see if I care. I am going to smash my way through that and somehow make something out of nothing here. Because the Nazis see that the death of truth leaves an appalling void, and they tried to fill it with, to coin a phrase, a triumph of the will. If they couldn't find truth, they were going to create it by sheer determination. And whatever you think of that as an enterprise, it is not a rejection of postmodernism. It's an embrace of it. It starts with an acceptance that there is no truth and then seeks to find something less undignified than gluttony and less pathetic than lying down and dying. And in a way, you close the circle. You go back to a pre-moral world, but not by going backwards, by going forwards. And I say, Hitler hated Christianity just the way a Nietzschean Superman would hate Christianity. And, of course, there have been people who have continued to portray Hitler as a traditionalist. There are lots of people out there who say Hitler was a Christian. And the evidence, his relationship with the churches and so on, there's no way of sustaining this, never mind his conduct. But even in theory, he doesn't believe in the traditional family. I mean, yeah, sure, there's some of the images there of these German maidens tilling the soil and raising a bunches of children, but they also set up breeding camps and stuff. I mean, there's no real attachment to a traditional understanding of anything. How is eugenics connected with a traditional view of the family? Yeah, the point of cocking the pistol at the mention of culture is not to restore it. It's because of a sort of ironic awareness of the abyss. And when he cocks his Browning, what can the thinking man do except reach for his own gun? Where you get dragged down to their level. As I put it, if truth is not objective but man-made, it will be made not by the most intelligent man, nor the most decent, since there is no decency, but by the most strong-willed. And fascism is all about that strong will, about the man of action. And Hannah Arendt, who kind of wrote the book on totalitarianism in the early 50s, said, "It is not the truthfulness of the leader's words, but the infallibility of his actions, which is the basis for the structure." And Mussolini himself boasted that he really didn't have any specific doctrine. He said, "With ideas as with women, the more you love them, the more they make you suffer." So he'd be in a heap of trouble with the postmoderns today for that metaphor, but it is a rejection of thinking. Fascism desires man to be active and engaged in action with all his energies. It wants him to be virilely conscious of existing difficulties and ready to meet them. It considers the fact that life is a battle and that it is man's task to conquer for himself that which is really worthy of him. And he said, we don't have a program, we just want to rule over all of Italy. You know, if you've ever given much thought to Satan's rebellion against God, you'd have to conclude that he knew it couldn't work. He can't have been that stupid, right? It's too obvious. He knew God too well to think he was going to pull this off. It has the same nihilistic frenzy to it as Nazism. Now, that's one kind of totalitarianism. What about Bolshevism? Isn't it the opposite pole? Don't we have right and left here? Nazism is sort of atavistic in its imagery. It's an attempt to put emotion in the place of reason. Bolshevism and Marxism are hyper-rationalistic, scholastic, hair-splitting. There's a great story of this venerable American Marxist Max Shachtman looking at the Vietnam War and deciding he would support the war because the protesters were the bourgeoisie and the hard hats backing the war and the soldiers fighting it were the working class. I mean, isn't that marvelously disconnected from anything except this frenetic application of reason to the nth degree? But I'm going to claim that Marxism is every bit as much about the will to power, the will to believe. Because the point of Marxism is not that it makes sense. It's that you make yourself believe it even though it doesn't. There's that you lift yourself up by your mental bootstraps, including the fact that so many of these Marxists were bourgeois. Like Molotov. What's Molotov doing with a proletarian consciousness? He's a cousin of the composer Scriabin. He's making himself believe it. He is willing himself into the proletariat. And then Stalin's whole program for the Soviet Union was to push history forward, to do voluntaristically what history had not done, which is the antithesis of the vision of Marxism as the inexorable unfolding of material forces. It's a blazing contradiction, but you make yourself believe it by an effort of the will. But there was a line, somebody saying, "I know nothing more beautiful than the Appassionata. I could hear it every day. It's marvelous, unearthly music. Every time I hear those notes, I think with pride and perhaps childlike naivete that it is wonderful what man can accomplish. But I cannot listen to music often. It affects my nerves. I want to say amiable stupidities and stroke the heads of people who can create such beauty in a filthy hell. But today is not the time to stroke people's heads. Today hands descend to split skulls open, split them open ruthlessly, although opposition to all violence is our ultimate ideal." That's Lenin to Maxim Gorky, which sounds exactly like it would be one of Hitler's henchpersons. It's strange how often you get these eerie parallels, including, as I say, the voluntarism at the heart of Stalinism. And you look at the names, right? Stalin, the man of steel. Molotov, the hammer. This, again, is straight out of Wagner meets late 19th century industrialization. And I know that it's supposedly this great confrontation of the 20th century is left against right. Even those who aren't sympathetic to Bolshevism think of it as a nihilistic left but a reactionary right. But it's amazing what a pass Marxism gets to this day. If it is discovered that you were a Marxist in college, people think it's cute. If it was discovered that you've been a Nazi in college, your career is over. You are done. And yet, as early as 1939, it became obvious that these two superficially different movements were far more similar than they were different. Dates that should live in infamy: August 23rd, 1939. Right, so a few nods. The Nazi-Soviet Pact. Suddenly, Hitler and Stalin, who were meant to be the worst enemies, the cartoon you're not now looking at, somebody drew in a rage after the Nazi-Soviet Pact, shows Hitler and Stalin shaking hands, and Hitler saying, "the scum of the earth," I believe, and Stalin is saying, "the bloody assassin of the workers." But as a matter of fact, the totalitarians themselves had long known of the similarities. When the communists and the Nazis were having their bloody street fights in Germany in the 20s, both parties would waive the membership requirements for somebody coming over from the other party because they knew those are our people. They knew all about it. And Erich Hoffer's book, The True Believer, I can't talk about totalitarianism without mentioning this strange little book of aphorisms, very much thought that there's a kind of psychological type, that this insane faith in a cause substitutes for a loss of faith in oneself. But of course, you could lose faith in yourself at any time throughout human history. It's actually quite easy. Nazism, though, and Bolshevism only turned up in the 20th century, and I'm saying here it's not loss of faith in oneself, it's loss of faith in truth that leads this kind of personality, at least, to go in this direction. And there's a book, Witness, by Whittaker Chambers, that I think I may have mentioned last year as well. It's a very strange and compelling book. Chambers was at the heart of the anti-communist uproar of the late 40s. He was the critical witness against Alger Hiss, who got him convicted of having been a Soviet spy or having lied about perjury. But the book is not about that. The book is about Chambers' whole strange life and his attempt to be a Christian witness. But he has a story. In 1938, he met with General Walter Krivitsky, who was a KGB or NKVD defector. And they sat down. Somebody had got them together, and they sat there in awkward silence, two ex-communists, very distrustful. And Krivitsky would be assassinated 3 years later. And after this long, awkward silence, the only language they shared is German. So Krivitsky, without looking at Chambers, says, "Ist der Sowjetregierung ein fasciste Regierung?" Is the Soviet regime a fascist regime? And he said, this is a typical communist thing to start a conversation with this one theoretical question that will determine everything else that happens in the whole course of the meeting. And Chambers sits there for a while thinking how bitterly he feels about all this, and finally says, yeah, it is. So he knew as early as 1938 that Bolshevism was fascism, just one more form of it. And if it weren't true, this incredible mental flexibility of communists, if communism was such an ideologically rigid system, how is it that they could flip the party line from Hitler is the enemy of the workers to Hitler is actually struggling against the capitalists in the West, and then when Hitler invades the Soviet Union, flip right back to Hitler's the enemy of the workers? How could you tolerate people being airbrushed out of photographs? How could you put up with all these dizzying twists and turns of the party line? How could you swallow the voluntarism of things like Stakhanovism, the guy who could mine 20 times as much coal as his quota just by wanting to? And why couldn't the Soviet Union become a normal state? Why couldn't it think its way out of the mess it had thought its way into? And the answer is because it didn't think its way into it. Because, in fact, where does truth come from in Marxism? Well, it doesn't, does it? All there is class consciousness. There is the ideas of the bourgeoisie created by the experience of the material relations of production in their lives, and then there is the class consciousness of the proletariat, created by their experience of being oppressed and communal. It's just another of these epiphenomena, coming not from the genes in this case, but from the economic substratum. Ideas are just tools of class struggle. They are no more than that, and they can in principle be no more than that. And as I say, you get all these eerie similarities, including, the secret police, right? The original secret police are not the Gestapo. They're actually the Cheka, a force Lenin set up during the Civil War. That it's not just its operations and personnel that are secret, its existence was a secret. And its name is one of these, chop off the first bits of some words and stick them together. The Soviets love to do that, right? And so did the Nazis. Gestapo is Geheime Staatspolizei, right? Ge from Geheime, Sta from Staats, and then Po from Polizei. The Soviets, and they did this too. There's this extraordinary similarity in the two movements. Now, I've never found, totalitarian theory is a very convincing thing with one huge flaw. I'm going to bring a note of comic relief into this talk, and perhaps long overdue, you will say, have you the scene in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where Arthur Dent is talking to Slarta Bartfast, this wise old man with a secret sorrow, which is that he has a really silly name. And at one point, Slarta Bartfast sighs and he says, perhaps I'm old and tired, but I think the chances of finding out what's actually going on are so absurdly remote that the only thing to do is say, hang the sense of it and keep yourself busy. I'd much rather be happy than write any day. And Arthur says, and are you? And Slarta Bartfast goes, no. Well, that's where it all falls down, of course. Right? You can't bootstrap. You cannot bring ideas into existence just by needing them or wanting them. It's simply done because you know you did it. It's like a magician trying to fool himself. But he saw himself put the rabbit in the hat. There's no way he thinks it appeared from nowhere. And because of this, I think there's always something weirdly fey and death cultish about totalitarianism. There is the death's head is always showing through, at least in part. And by the way, there's a Jordan Peterson video called How Hitler Was Even More Evil Than You Think, where he talks about the whole enterprise tumbling down, Hitler in the bunker deciding the German people were unworthy of him and deserved to have been smashed to bits, and then finally killing himself. He was given to suicide threats. He finally killed himself. And Peterson says, people talk as though this was somehow an unanticipated outcome of his career. But sometimes when people have very complicated psychological problems, you just turn off the sound and watch the pictures. And you could easily conclude that this was where Hitler was going all along. That it really was headed in that direction. Which brings us to this odd kind of question about totalitarianism. The academic theory of totalitarianism always had one very major flaw. It could never decide if the adherents were sincere or not. Was Hitler really a Nazi? I mean, it sounds like a loopy question. If Hitler wasn't a Nazi, who was? He was just interested in power. Was Stalin really a Marxist? The overwhelming consensus of opinion is that he wasn't. That he was just interested in power. But how do you understand what power is? How do you choose ends for the exercise of power, except with some kind of intellectual, psychological apparatus? Robert Higgs once called this the interest or strain dichotomy. That is to say, are people professing ideas because they have a self-interest in professing those ideas, or because they have a psychological problem that draws them to those ideas? And funny, Marxists had the same problem. When you listen to Marxists raving on about capitalists, they could never decide if capitalists were sincere about their bourgeois ideology or whether they were lying. They would mix it up in the same sentence. It was a very, very peculiar phenomenon, but perhaps reflected some internal chaos. They didn't think it was odd because they lived in it. This thing, was Hitler really a Nazi? It's a bit like that thing when someone commits an act of terror and shouts Allahu Akbar, and people say, well, I wonder if he was crazy or if he was a real terrorist. It's like there would be perfectly rational reasons why you would slaughter a bunch of innocents in the street while shouting Allahu Akbar, and there would be crazy reasons, and we're trying to figure out which set this person holds. And there's something wrong with that theory, in my opinion. And I think there was in Orwell's too, because in 1984, when Winston Smith joins the Brotherhood, and of course you never know whether the resistance is real or just one more secret police front, but he's given Emmanuel Goldstein's book about doublethink, and about how the true believer forces him or herself to believe contradictory ideas to prove that they have subordinated themselves to the party by an act of will, that they have ceased to cling to ideas like truth, and have thoroughly mastered this nihilistic, baseless, mighty power of will. And so he's reading the book, And it goes, and here we reach the central secret. As we've seen, the mystique of the party, and above all of the inner party, depends upon doublethink. But deeper than this lies the original motive, the never-questioned instinct that first led to the seizure of power and brought doublethink, the thought police, continuous warfare, and all the other necessary paraphernalia into existence afterwards. This motive really consists... And then Winston Smith is interrupted, and he never gets back to the book. We never find out. But to me, it's not the psychological thing that Hoffer talks about, though that's clearly a part of it. Obviously, defective personalities are attracted to totalitarian movements. It's that if God is dead, we're stuck playing God, and we can't do it. We've lost faith in the possibility of meaning, but we can't live without meaning, and so we try to conjure it into existence, knowing it cannot work, and we are therefore in a highly agitated psychological state. And we try very hard to get rid of the psychological agitation by increasingly vehement, violent, and defiant acts. Say, I'll show you traditional morality doesn't exist. I will do more and more things that are contrary to traditional morality, and I will finally banish the ghost of a suspicion that there is a truth written on the heart, human heart, and that we all know what it is. And it cannot work. But it is a very serious trap. There's a line from J. Budjachevsky that the motto, do the right thing and let God take care of the consequences, makes sense only on the assurance that he will take care of the consequences. Without that assurance, doing the right thing means taking care of the consequences, or trying to. That if you really believe that God is dead, if you really believe there is no truth, you are faced with an appalling metaphysical task that would be unbearable even if it were not for the knowledge that you necessarily possess that you are not up to doing it. But what if God is dead? What then are you meant to do? Where is your solution? You know, Lena Riefenstahl's cinema masterpiece is called A Triumph of the Will. That is a very revealing, very deep title. And again, I actually had a poster for The Triumph of the Will, which I was just going to show you because it is so socialist realist. It could have come absolutely out of Stalin's art factories, except for the swastika. But everything else about it, again, even the styles converge. You know, if there's no objective basis for truth, we either sink into apathy, we sink into hedonism, or we try and pull ourselves up by our metaphysical bootstraps and make us believe something by the strength of our will. And it doesn't matter very much what it is, at least in theory, does it? Because we know in advance it's arbitrary. The problem is if there really is truth, and we've been led to believe that there isn't, something very nasty is liable to happen to us. And again, if you read That Hideous Strength, you see the fate of various people, as Lewis conceives it, who have convinced themselves there is no truth and have started to heed promptings from a very, very sinister quarter indeed. But the dilemma didn't go away when Hitler shot himself or when Stalin died or when the Berlin Wall fell. The problem of postmodernism had this egregious manifestation in the middle of the 20th century, but it's still with us. Normally in much more benign forms, because most people do have a conscience that operates. It's amazing the effort that you will see people expending sometimes to try to convince themselves and you that although there is no truth, we can arrive at traditional morality and hold on to it and be nice to one another. That we can somehow bootstrap ourselves in a way that doesn't lead to death camps. But of course it doesn't work because these civilized, humane things we're clinging to either come from truth or they're just straws. Again, it happened this spring that I found a book on our shelves by Erich Fromm. I read a book of his called To Have or To Be years ago, and I found it very helpful in my, as John points out, my pre-Christian phase. And this one's called Man for Himself, and it's written in 1947, so it's written in the shadow of the war. And Fromm, in the book and in his career, is trying to create this kind of humanistic ethics that comes from within, that is freed from external constraints and influences and authorities, but is somehow not relativistic. And he takes the death of God for granted. He quotes Dostoyevsky, if God is dead, everything is allowed. And he says most people believe that. They think either we have God and the churches uphold the moral order or we're going to sink into chaos and anarchy. But he says no. Humanistic ethics takes the position that if man is alive, he knows what is allowed. And to be alive means to be productive, to use one's powers not for any purpose transcending man, but for oneself, to make sense of one's existence, to be human. And this was very influential in the 1960s, too. Of course, a lot of people went around trying to do this kind of thing, and most of them were not Charles Manson. But he's insisting that man knows what is allowed. Well, there must be something that's allowed. And who is it allowed by? Because if it's allowed by us, we can allow anything or nothing, and we have no basis for choosing. It's like, poetry, free verse. How do you decide if there's no rhyme or meter? What word are you going to put down? There's really no choice. He says, no, it's the reaction of our total personality to its proper functioning or dysfunctioning. And he winds up going back to evolution and Herbert Spencer and saying, well, ethical is that which propagates the individual in a wholesome kind of way. And he tries to save us from relativism by going to materialism. But the shelves, I think, are entirely bare. Even Margaret Somerville, some of you may have encountered her attempts to create a non-transcendent ethics. Margaret is, I think, a Christian. She's been pretty coy about it, but I'm pretty sure that she eventually, was forced to blurt it out. But in The Ethical Canary, she says, I propose two foundational principles for shared ethics: deep respect for all life, in particular human life, and profound respect for the human spirit. In this present book, I'm putting forward two concepts that I believe can help us to implement those principles, recognizing and developing a sense of the sacred that we can all share, the secular sacred, and adopting a basic presumption in favor of the natural as a starting point for our decision-making about ethics. Well, good luck with that, mate. Where in nature do you find these famous ethics? There's red and tooth and claw and mandibles, right? Or insects. Never mind lions. Horrifying. And we don't all share it, and there is no secular sacred. I mean, she means well, she's intelligent, and, I very much appreciate this effort, but it's just so obvious. She's putting the rabbit in and then pulling it out again, and a lot of people are going, well, no, I don't even like rabbit. Somerville says we still need taboos. Okay, fine, but where do you get the taboo store closed? It just isn't going to work. And Edmund Burke, again, people have seen this coming for centuries. Burke said, I allow that if no supreme ruler exists, wise to form and potent to enforce the moral law, there is no sanction to any contract, virtual or even actual, against the will of prevalent power. On that hypothesis, let any set of men be strong enough to set their duties at defiance, and they cease to be duties any longer. And that, of course, is exactly what the Nazis did. They simply set their duties at defiance, and they ceased to be duties. All kinds of people have warned about this. And again, I almost shouldn't mention Donald Trump. It's funny to think, now the talk gets controversial. But I know a lot of people like Donald Trump and support Donald Trump, and a lot of people, and I don't mean the usual suspects, I mean me, really don't like Donald Trump very much. Because I just think that his character is reprehensible. I think that he is a post-truth president, and he's the left's Frankenstein. They went around for decades saying there was no truth, and then the Republicans nominated a guy who thought so, and they all went, you can't say that. Well, you said it, and now he's saying it. But Andrew Coyne, who also very National Post columnist, for those of you who aren't from around here, and also really, really dislikes Donald Trump and can't stop shouting when people don't understand spoken English about it. But he said, it is, of course, the sheer volume of his affronts to decency, to the truth, to lawful government that works its magic. Several a day, sometimes, each one of which might have ended any previous presidency. But together they advertise a disdain for norms so comprehensive that it's contagious, even liberating. Wouldn't we all like to be so unburdened? So if you're a Trump fan, forget that was Trump. But yeah, there is this initial sort of appeal, hey, I can cast off all restraints. The problem is if you don't like it, how on earth are you going to get them back? I would say I've sometimes fantasized about a political career that would be so short it wouldn't even disturb my plans for lunch. But my idea would be to run as a Whig and promise a triumph of the won't. Right? This is my slogan. All the things I wouldn't do that I just think government should leave to the private sector. The Good Samaritan didn't go looking for a bureaucrat. Right? But in a much more fundamental way, the problem of the 20th century is not that the Nazis were some backward-looking force that burst upon us from the Neolithic or the Paleolithic or the Triassic. It was that they embraced postmodernism, that they understood as clearly as the Bolsheviks did that the way Western thought had been going for hundreds of years, the logical stopping point was God is dead, there is no truth, anything is permitted, nothing means anything, and the only things you can do are lie down and die, eat until you burst, or else do something so horrific that at least for a moment you feel like you're really alive. And, of course, instead of trying to find their way back to God, they embraced futility in the only spirit you really can, which is a profoundly unclean spirit. Because, of course, there is truth. I mean, St. Paul anticipated all this. We see through a glass darkly. Of course, human reason is flawed. We all know it. We've got one, right? But we know it's flawed. There's some ruler other than the one that we ourselves have been given, that we have some kind of odd access to, so that we know that our intellect is corrupt, we know that our will is corrupt. You know, I've sometimes wondered, I don't know to what extent animals are self-aware, but do you think any lion ever, having bungled the takedown of a gazelle, sat there on the savannah thinking, I am a fool? Do you think there's any human being alive who's never had that thought? You know, 10 times a day, have it before breakfast. You know, there is something out there, but it's very important because of what happens if people reject it. So, having explained that the eruptions of the 20th century are a product of postmodernism, not of atavism, and that we, of course, face more of this in all kinds of ways, the personally destructive, the apathetic, the hedonistic, the politically nihilistic, the large-scale nihilism, all of these things are out there, and they will always be out there, and the temptation will always be there. But in a world that has intellectually disarmed itself, we are far more vulnerable to them than we have been in ages past. So that's pretty bleak. I just wanted to, therefore, leave you with a thought from G.K. Chesterton in 1925, that Christianity always rises again because it is a God who knows the way out of the grave. Truth does live. And that is the saving grace in all of this. But it's really important that people should understand it and look for it because of what happens to them if they don't. Thank you.